Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to today's webinar with sharedserviceslink.com and also Spend Matters. We are here to learn about top procure-to-pay secrets to realize your cost reduction and working capital ambitions. So, to kick off today's proceedings, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Matthew Garrow-Fisher, Head of Research at sharedserviceslink.com. Now, if you don't know about sharedserviceslink.com, a bit of background about us. We were set up in 2007 with one objective, and that's to provide best practice information for the finance and accounting shared services market through our conferences, our webinars, our reports, our news, and our fantastic website. So if you're not already a member, please do become one. It's free, and as a member, you get access to a wealth of our information. So, as I said, today we're focusing on top P2P secrets to realizing your cost reduction and working capital ambitions. So let's have a look at the agenda for the next hour. So first of all, I'll touch on how this session works in terms of the technical nature of GoToWebinar. Then I'll also briefly talk about the intention of the session, why this was actually set up in the first place. Then I'll hand over to our expert for the day from Spend Matters, Jason Bush. And finally, I'll end with question and answers from you, the audience. So, how does this session work? Well, it's a very straightforward platform. I'm sure many of you have used it before already. If you've got any technical questions, we do have technical support on the line ready to assist you, so please use your free text box in your GoToWebinar panel for any help on this. So as I mentioned, we're all on this webinar for a very important reason, and that's to gain very relevant and practical tips on how you can realize your cost reduction and working capital ambitions, gaining clarity from some real top industry experts. So please use this opportunity to put forward questions both to me and to Jason Bush, who are on the line today. So how that works is very, very simple. You've got a free text box, and you can submit your questions via this. And they will then come to me, and I will distribute it either to myself or to Jason in the last few minutes of the call. So as I said, I urge you to use this opportunity to get answers to the burning questions or issues that you have. This is very much a two-way dialogue, so please do take advantage of that. And just to bear in mind, the sooner you send your question to me, the more likely it will be asked. Okay, so what is the intention of this session? Well, we at Shared Services Link did quite a lot of research over the last few months with procure-to-pay leaders. We actually interviewed around 80 procure-to-pay global leaders, mainly based in the US for this research project. So talked to stakeholders in functions like, well, process owners, procure-to-pay process owners, heads of accounts payable, procurement, shared services, disbursements, payments, and treasury. And we wanted to uncover some key things. One of them was what is actually keeping them up at night in the P2P world. The other is what is their actual aspirations? What do they want to achieve? And the third element that we wanted to uncover was how did they actually plan to achieve those targets or aspirations? So we uncovered quite a lot of common challenges, and those challenges, actually stemmed around two key elements, and that's a lack of visibility and a lack of control in the procure-to-pay process. And if visibility and control was lost, then these could cause further problems, and those problems could escalate. So some of the issues that were raised that, if no action was taken, these factors could get worse and worse. So procure-to-pay operational costs could spiral out of control. fraud could start draining money out of the company. You know, checks might have to be reissued, late payment fees would build up and up, tax penalties would be uncovered and have to be paid. Even suppliers might go bust, causing quite serious disruptions, obviously, to making your end products. And a lot of people mentioned about, you know, the higher value added activities what were kind of overshadowed by transactional work in P2P. And P2P staff weren't able to actually conduct activities like cash flow analysis and forecasting or contribute to them, which in turn would cause bad decisions to be made by finance directors and strategy setters like CFOs. So that ultimately affected the organization's bottom line. So those were the kind of common challenges and the worries from not doing anything. So what were these P2P leaders' aspirations? What were they targeted with at the moment? Well, many of them wanted to move to touchless procure-to-pay processing through much more automation. They were looking at raising productivity, so the number of invoices processed each year per FTE would needed to be raised significantly. AP total labour costs needed to be drastically reduced, and that was a lot of the time in the conversations I had was a direct kind of target from the FD or from the CFO. They wanted to increase spend visibility, reduce process cycle times. There's quite a few other targets and aspirations on that list. I won't go into too much detail. So how are they going to achieve these aspirations, and what were they going to do going forward in 2012, 2013? Well, there was various strategies that they mentioned, and also technologies on how to get there. So technologies, for example, like e-invoicing, data capture and line item auto-matching, workflow or exception management, and, you know, strategies, people strategies, looking more carefully at change management, looking at dynamic discounting, supply chain financing, or vendor master data management. So why is all this research important? What's the point of all this? Well, we realized that actually, you know, implementing these strategies is quite hard to do, and we were told in our research that the best way of learning about this is to hear how others have done that through case studies and through, you know, peer-to-peer interactions. And that's why we're setting up the annual Procure-to-Pay leaders meeting, which takes place this May in Chicago. So we're doing this as a result of this research, and it's an event designed to help mindshare the best ideas for overcoming these current market challenges I've just mentioned, with end users leading the discussions. So I'll talk about a little bit more about that later on, but how does the work of Spend Matters fit into this objective? Well, today we're focusing around, we talked about strategies and technologies. We're now focusing today on those P2P technologies, and specifically technologies that would help you achieve those aspirations around cost reduction and improving your working capital. Actually, one of the most brought up aspirations in our research. And there was 3 key questions that people kept on asking us in our research around P2P technologies. I'll let Jason uncover what those are and then what the answers are, or some of the answers are to those questions. But Jason Bush from Spend Matters and his team have created 2 quite fundamental research reports in their Compass series, really addressing all of these issues in quite a lot of detail, and I urge you to download them. The first is a foundational look at P2P technologies, and the second is e-invoicing comes of age, discovering what's possible from the latest e-invoicing and invoice automation capabilities. So those reports answer some of these common questions around P2P technologies, and also go into a bit more detail as well in terms of what does it mean to be world-class, and how do you get there. So this webinar is really an opportunity for you, the audience, to ask the authors of these reports, the people that have produced these research reports, on how you can jump over some of the obstacles that are getting you in the way of becoming a world-class procure-to-pay operation. So, without further ado, to share insight into some of the research that Spend Matters have been involved in, and to answer some of those really common questions that we were asked around P2P technologies, it's over to you, Jason.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. It's great to be here today and to partner with Shared Services Link on this webinar and broader research and conference initiatives. We're very excited to welcome Shared Services Link to our headquarters of Chicago. Next slide, please.
Sorry about this, Jason.
We'll fix this difficulty in 1 second.
Perfect. There we go.
Excellent. Great. So just some very quick background on who Spend Matters is. As I mentioned, we're headquartered in Chicago and very excited to welcoming the Shared Services Link team to our hometown for their event in May. We're a team of 12 people at this point. We cover a range of technologies, processes, and commodities in the procurement and supply chain market. But purchase-to-pay is tops on our radar and an area we publish on extensively. I personally lead our research in this area, and it's just a key consideration for us going forward. We've taken a very close look recently at a couple of different areas within P2P specifically. We've done some generalized research in the e-procurement space and e-invoicing space combined, along with auxiliary areas as well, like catalog and content management, supplier enablement, and the like. We've also taken a very close look at e-invoicing specifically. So from that, we've decided to kind of share the highlights of our research and insights in this webinar today, but we'd strongly encourage you to check out our site or the Shared Services Link site, who also has got our research in the area for download. And it's free and available for anyone on the webinar today to go check it out. It's our perspective today that procure-to-pay technology brings significant opportunity to drive cost savings, but also to change demand patterns and look at operating efficiency and working capital. But we often see this market as very fragmented and confusing. If you look at e-invoicing alone and all the network operators in Europe, it's enough to make your head spin. There's probably more dictators in the history of the world than there are, or at least a similar number to the number of e-invoicing providers today. Very large market. And at the same time, we've got to bridge the gap between finance and procurement. There's multiple functions even within finance getting involved in the sector today, and we've got to look at the needs of AP, treasury, procurement, and supply chain as well as we consider these areas to look at. Next slide, please. So a number of key questions we're going to answer today. How do you choose the right procure-to-pay technologies for you? We'll cover this in detail. We're not going to cover it generically. We're actually going to look at specific cases based on organizational requirements and constraints. What can current electronic invoicing and invoice automation capabilities achieve? We want to tell the current nature of what's possible, but also provide a bit of history as well. And then we want to look at what must be done to maximize the return on P2P investments. What are some very specific tips of the trade? Next slide, please. I've divided my talk into 3 sections specifically. We're going to give an introduction and backdrop to the P2P area. We're going to double-click on a few key areas of focus, especially on the e-invoicing space. We don't have time to get into e-procurement in too much detail today, but we're going to get as far as we can. And then last, we're going to go through a number of concluding thoughts and recommendations. I want to caution everybody, this is a content-rich presentation. The slides are going to be made available And the underlying research on which it's based, which is even more dense, is also available. So if we go through things too quickly, please feel free to reference it later in more detail via download on the Shared Services link site or our site. And please feel free to ask questions at the end as well. Next slide, please. So let's quickly touch on the history of the e-procurement market in more detail. If we look at the history of P2P and e-procurement, we often see a range of benefits from deploying these solutions. Not to mention all of them, but obviously thwarting maverick purchases, off-contract purchases, the demand management side by lowering purchase volume in general, increasing PO throughput per FTE, lots of different benefits. And there's such a wide range of technology, even within just the e-procurement space, to support these initiatives. We've got to consider core e-procurement technology for requisitioning. We've got to consider order management and visibility, supplier connectivity, catalog management. It's quite complicated if you look at everything that's out there. At the same time, it's no longer just the best-of-breed market. The ERP providers, SAP and Oracle, have come a long way. So now we've got to look at not just best-of-breed solutions and ERP solutions, but even ERP partner solutions. And then we've got lots of opportunities from independent vendors as well, some of whom specialize in very specific areas, others like Ariba, which are much more broad. So we've got a wide opportunity. The technology today is quite proven, though apples-to-apples comparisons are hard for a number of reasons in terms of what is out there. Next slide, please. So how did this market evolve? If we look at a brief history of the P2P and ERP sector, first, there were a number of vendors, shall we say, in the late 90s and before the dot-com implosion, if you will, and the early B2B implosion. We had Ariba and Commerce One. There were others like RightWorks and Telesys. Even SAP and Oracle tried to compete at this point in time. Then we saw the evolution of ERP and the continued, I'd say, maturity of technologies, which started out really in quite a dreadful manner if you look at how implementations went versus how they were planned to go, to a point where ERP technology has matured and is quite sophisticated and in many cases can compete head-to-head, if not surpass, best-of-breed in certain areas. Then we saw the marketplace rush. I'm not sure how many folks remember the whole marketplace boom of the joke at the time was being able to IPO your company's spend. We saw organizations look at the valuation of software companies and say, let's band together with our competitors and see if we can't create a marketplace. We know what happened to 99% of those. But what happened after the last economic downturn, really around 2008, 2009, is a maturity of the overall market and the need to focus on procurement and AP at the same time, the need to focus on working capital. And at the same time, we saw the evolution of technology to the point where there were many good options. So we had a need to focus on the problem, and the technology was much more sophisticated and mature. It's a good place for us to be. Next slide, please. So it's not hard to build the business case today for P2P automation. Companies that focus on P2P investments typically focus on automating a number of processes. A lot of this is about bringing procurement and finance together. Mentioned a few of these benefits, but to quickly jump into in a couple of slides, some metrics, which I want to share from Hackett Group. There are some tangible ways of proving the immediate value of both e-procurement and e-invoicing solutions around reducing headcount, around bringing greater spend under management, around on-contract purchases. Yet there's a number of other more subtle benefits as well. And in many cases, as we evolve our P2P selection and systems to take advantage of being able to more closely manage and monitor working capital, and then if we have the financing means to do so, or we have banking partners or third parties who can provide early payment discounting, we can get our suppliers to actually have uptake on that. We can begin to treat P2P as a profit center as well. So lots of opportunities. Next slide, please. But a lot of organizations ignored the early complexity of making P2P work. We saw the challenge of automating spend in different areas. MRO and indirect catalog purchases on the one side, more complicated indirect spend types around print, marketing spend, travel spend. It didn't all fit into one solution. So we often thought we could pursue one path, but we had to pursue multiple ones. A lot of organizations did not think through the complexity of the whole e-invoicing component at the same time as e-procurement. This was one of the challenges in many cases of early ERP procurement initiatives, where the invoicing piece was very often left out of the equation. Many other challenges as well, but over time a number of additional issues also cropped up. Deployment costs, often cases, went far beyond what companies thought they would. Organizations entered the procurement paradigm thinking they would solve the paper challenge, but in lots of cases they still had the same number of paper invoices and POs coming in and going out. Keeping information, whether it's catalog content tied to specific SKUs, say a notebook computer or a server or some type of office supply, keeping that current and pricing current also proved challenging. And then building greater visibility between organizational groups with different needs and motivations also proved challenging as well. But the benefits are strong, and as the next slide will show, quantifying the benefits of P2P automation is really straightforward. Next slide, please. Looking at the ROI, for example, of average versus world-class organizations as Hackett defines it, we see a significant difference. Actually, if we could back up one slide, would be great. Thank you. World-class organizations have an average procurement annual ROI of nearly 700% versus average performers. And what's interesting here is they're investing far more in technology per FTE. And in a lot of cases, it's going into P2P specifically. The cost of other systems in this area, e-sourcing, contract management, supplier management, historically has paled in comparison with P2P. So we can safely say a lot of this investment among world-class companies is going into P2P specifically. They're also getting the cost of transactional resources lower, but spending more on strategic resources. And the visibility these processes, these systems afford enables these top-performing companies to have much closer involvement between finance and procurement in budgeting together. Now, how does that translate into world-class performance when it comes to P2P systems? Next slide, please. You see world-class organizations reducing their overall purchasing costs by nearly 2/3. These organizations at the same time can more than double the number of POs that each FTE can process. And we can see these organizations managing each $1 billion of indirect spend with significantly 50% fewer resources. Next slide, please. So how do we go further in investigating what these world-class companies are doing from a technology perspective? We're not going to cover all the grounds today, but there's a number of specific areas, especially in the invoicing space, we think are really important to probe on and investigate. And as we go through them, we'd like to impress upon the audience the importance of considering all of these areas together rather than just individual components. So first, we're going to quickly go through a history of AP automation in this space. We're going to touch on these e-invoicing components and give some brief maturity models as well. So to start with a brief history of P2P and invoice automation, a lot of folks on this call probably have been in the P2P space for quite some time. You probably remember back office automation initiatives and perhaps even shifts to centralization and internal shared services. A lot of these efforts were focused on consistency around AP process. They were partially focused on efficiency, but consistency and was often key. Now, more recently, we've seen efforts moving into the BPO world as well, and we've even seen kind of captive centers and large organizations working with both providers and on their own in countries like India and certain countries in Central Europe and Latin America to create these centers. But outside of creating some degree of standardization, the real benefits, we believe when it comes to P2P and AP and invoice automation come from standardizing on technology, which can drive other benefits. Next slide, please. So where does this leave us today? If we can focus on improving quality at the source, right, getting better inputs to drive outcomes and quality, we can get much further down the path. And this has been the focus of top performers today as we see it in our research. If we can eliminate or reduce latency, obviously there's benefits as well. But not just benefits, it enables a whole different means of managing the process and driving these outcomes around working capital and even potentially discounting programs as well, where the great majority of suppliers, if not all, have the actual chance of participating versus just having the ability to offer terms but nobody being able to actually take you up on it. It's important to realize here that not all E approaches are created equal. A lot of folks will put an E before invoicing or e-procurement and assume all the approaches are the same. But as we'll get into in a minute, there are lots of specific nuances that count in a major way. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Matt for the first poll question.
Thank you, Jason. And the first poll question of the day is, what technologies do you currently use in your P2P organization? Is it data capture and/or auto matching? And please select all that apply here, so you can select more than one answer. So do you use data capture and/or auto matching, workflow or exception management tools, e-invoicing? Do you use dynamic discounting or supply chain financing, or do you use some other technologies like T&E expenses reporting, P-cards, or another technology? We've had around 40% of the vote in, so please vote in the next 5 seconds, and we'll reveal the results very soon in 3, 2, 1. Okay, and we're just going to share the results with you now. So around half of you already use data capture technology or auto matching technology as well. The majority of you, almost 2/3, are using some kind of workflow solution. Surprisingly, actually, 2/5 of you are already using e-invoicing, and just over 10% of you are doing dynamic discounting or supply chain financing. So with those results, Jason, it's over to you.
Yeah, interesting approach. I suspect if we had asked the same questions here, we might have gotten a slightly different response if it was just a U.S. audience, especially on the invoicing and discount front. It's still extremely nascent here. And if you look at invoicing adoption by multinationals, electronic invoicing adoption, a lot of it is still skewed towards countries in which it's a requirement. Looking at the Nordic countries, looking now at Mexico, looking at Brazil and other countries as well. So if we look at what it takes to do e-invoicing right and to pave this foundation for P2P, I want to introduce a plumbing analogy on the next slide. Why do we need to think about plumbing? We can think about kind of the superficial exterior of buildings, whether they're houses, whether they're office buildings, and we can see polish, we can see pizzazz, we can see activity. But it's the plumbing that allows everything to work, whether it's the carpentry to put up the walls, whether it's the actual connecting pipes. That's what allows business to flow, and that's what allows commerce to flow when it comes to P2P as well. So as we get into the different elements of e-invoicing, I want you to think about the importance of complete systems, flexible systems. One pipe doesn't fit all suppliers. How we can integrate our plumbing with both other systems internally and the outside world. How we can ensure reliability, and how we can account for the fact that pipes need to connect us externally and information needs to flow out as well as in. Next slide, please. So what is the first kind of pipe we need for e-invoicing? We would argue it falls into a category, and it's much broader than simply portals, but we call it a supplier portal. And we published extensive research on Spend Matters in this whole area of supplier management and onboarding outside of P2P. But there's a need for a basic portal for onboarding to collect information. There's a need in more advanced cases for workflow, which can escalate and manage the collection of data accurately from suppliers as well. So thinking about how can we collect data, whether it's basic contact detail, banking detail, certifications around insurance, certifications in North America around diversity, SIC codes. How can we do this in an optimal manner and make sure it stays current, which is one of the absolute keys. Information, as we've learned in our research on the vendor side, becomes stale fast. And whether it's AP collecting it for their needs, or whether it's procurement collecting it for a broader set of needs around diversity or risk, we've got to make sure it stays current. But to enable basic e-invoicing, this concept of onboarding suppliers and collecting information, not to mention making sure we can map our suppliers' outputs from their systems on the receivable side for invoice generation matters as well. Next slide, please. So the next element we would argue we need in terms of these pipes for e-invoicing our broader solution interoperability and integration. So we've got to think about how these tools can integrate in the case of indirect purchases into e-procurement systems, in the case of services procurement into VMS tools for contingent and SOW and project-based spending. We've got to think about the integration into payment mechanisms. And it's our view here, there is never a one-size-fits-all approach. If somebody tells you, we're going to drive everything to a card, so we don't have a need for e-invoicing, they're probably a bank and trying to push you in one direction incorrectly. There's a great place for cards, don't get us wrong, but there's a place for lots of other payment mechanisms and tools, and this integration counts. It's absolutely critical as well to ensure that whether you go with a single vendor or multiple parties, that you have real-time linkages. And you've got to support requirements in local geographies too. Fortunately, if you look at some of the larger players in the space, the Aribas, the OB10s, and others, they've signed local partnerships to meet regulatory requirements in places like Mexico and all the Nordic countries, which is absolutely critical for doing business there. So in lots of cases, your partner can help you take advantage of that on the invoicing side. But the integration internally and externally matters equally. Next slide, please. The next type of pipes we need, continuing on this analogy, are for invoice and data submission and capture, and the ability to support and capture across multiple submission formats, and really focusing on enabling the broader supply base. So these are both large suppliers as well as small suppliers. And we're not going to get into the nuances of all the different approaches, whether there's direct systems connection, kind of a post-EDI approach, or whether you go to a supplier portal or virtual printer. There's lots of approaches here, but the key is not one size fits all, and we've got to think about how do we enable capture and submission across multiple size suppliers. For small suppliers in particular, it's critical to offer non-portal based solutions, we believe, as well. Driving folks to a portal every time is a recipe for not onboarding 100% of potential suppliers in the case. We've got to think about the ability to tie our systems together here. For example, the ability to flip a PO onto an invoice as well. I mentioned the concept of virtual printers. There's been a lot of talk in the market recently about this concept for smaller suppliers. I can say as a small supplier ourselves, we've submitted invoices via portals. We've submitted invoices via virtual printer approaches. We're agnostic in terms of what works, but speaking not as analysts, speaking as a small supplier ourselves, we think for that supplier, the process should be relatively seamless, and you should be able to go through an onboarding process in minutes or hours versus days or weeks, regardless of how that supplier is onboarded. Next slide, please. The next type of pipe we need, we will refer to as supplier networks. Now, there's a lot of discussion in the market as to what comprises a network. The key here is that we have local operators, especially in Europe, many, still hundreds of different providers. In North America and the rest of the world, we have a fewer number serving the market who tend to be larger. But the value of networks is really about enabling suppliers to ideally connect a single time in terms of their requirements, and then to make sure that you can service and work with those suppliers in various markets without having to go through a massive, unique one-off onboarding process and connectivity process each time as well. Critical as well to think about interoperability on the network front. No network is an island, despite what some organizations like to believe, and we believe it's critical to make sure anybody you work with can offer compatibility and interoperability with other networks as well. Next slide, please. The next set of pipes we're going to argue organizations need is around matching and workflow when it comes to e-invoicing, a truly essential component here. There's lots of different use cases for matching. You might want to match off of contract terms, POs, receipts, schedules. There can be other sources as well. But regardless of what you're matching off of, the ability to configure specific rules on the invoicing front is what will create significant efficiency, but also accuracy and effectiveness of the function. So creating matching linkages around dates, invoice amounts, types, codes, you name it, based on what you need. The ultimate goal here is to enable, in many cases as possible, a straight-through processing approach under ideal circumstances, and a set of escalations where there's not necessarily human involvement in the early stages if there are issues. Something is pulled manually, it goes back to the supplier for additional information if something is incorrect. So largely hands-off approach, not only to increase accuracy, but to create labor efficiencies as well and simply collect good data to begin with. Next set of pipes we need are around analytics and reporting. Lots of different capabilities here, and lots of organizations. We see organizations and companies not necessarily using the analytics just from their e-invoicing or P2P provider. We see usage of tools from BI providers as well, but understanding where you stack up, not just past performance internally, but understanding where you stack up from a benchmarking perspective, being able to dump data into an OLAP environment as well as Excel, being able to ideally share this data in a means which is highly visible across a dashboard as somebody logs into the system, whether they're an AP director, whether they're running a P2P systems environment, whether they're the head of procurement, the treasurer of the organization, making sure that there are dashboard views based on roles as well for that high-level reporting. Ignoring analytics is something which is bound to get organizations to a certain point, but will limit the collaboration across functions. So think about analytics as a key pipe to begin with. Next slide, please. I want to touch on now e-invoicing maturity models. This is something we go into great detail on in our research, and you can look at it in both papers. But we think it's critical to consider the "you are here" dot when it comes to where an organization stands today. In our model, we consider 5 different levels when it comes to e-invoicing, which go into an evaluation as to where an organization stands. So we consider organizational structure, technology environment, P2P data and systems linkages, discounting and payment maturity, and where a company is on the supplier enablement continuum. Now we think these fields are definitely a first step, but what's key to remember here is that moving in between each level comes with a similar opportunity to improve the financial and operational outcomes of the business. We sometimes joke, but it's true, a lot of companies are stage 0. They're not even on the map. But simply figuring out how do we jump ahead is not necessarily where an organization should go. Moving from level to level brings a significant incremental benefit. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into great detail on our integrated maturity model. It's available for download in the papers. But just to touch on how we see high maturity level organizations performing, some metrics to strive for. Typically, at what we call level 3 maturity, which is the most senior level of maturity, we see over 80% greater workforce efficiency from an organizational structure perspective on the level 1 maturity organizations. E-invoicing is typically at the core of these programs and models. We see lots of integration use cases, and we see new metrics and goals put in place. For example, 0% tolerance of multiple payments. Organizations at this stage of maturity might have less of a focus on audit recovery as part of their broader process and governance of how they work with suppliers and drive compliance, simply because the data is right to begin with. You don't have to think about credits as much if you're collecting the right information and gathering it to begin with. We see organizations at this phase also get more involved in discounting and payment programs in terms of adoption, whether they fund them themselves or they fund them through a third party. And from a supplier enablement perspective, these organizations are focused on 100% enablement. There is no 80-20 rule. It's about getting all suppliers involved. Now I'm going to turn it back to Matt for our second poll question.
Thank you very much indeed, Jason. So we are at our last poll of the day, and the question is, what overall level of e-invoicing maturity do you see your organization currently at? We looked at the maturity model. So there was 3 different levels: low maturity, level 1, level 2, which gives long-term sustainability and results, or level 3, high maturity. So from the table that Jason just showed, giving all of those different areas, what overall level of e-invoicing maturity are you? We've had just over half of the votes in. We're closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay. And it looks as though, Jason, the audience is at fairly low level of maturity for e-invoicing. 85% are at level 1, with 5% at level 2, and only a tenth of the audience at a high maturity level. Back to you, Jason.
That's great, Matt. We're not going to embarrass any folks in terms of where they reported themselves, but we will say honesty. Honesty is a virtue, and that self-assessment is great because if you know you're at level 1, it's so critical to understand the steps to get to level 2. So knowing in where you are, that kind of you are here dot, is so valuable in terms of that incremental step change to get to the next level. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to conclude my part of the presentation now with a number of thoughts and recommendations. Apologies in advance. These are dense slides. Again, slides will be made available, and there's even more detail on these slides in our research as well. Next slide, please. So first, I want to touch on how do we build the business case for P2P investment. Got a lot of data here. There's lots of different use cases. You'd be surprised in the organizations we've worked with over the years, in many cases, how a single use case is driving the primary initiative for a particular investment. One of the first we've seen, kind of a very subtle one, is simply buying less. And here we're speaking more broadly of P2P, not just e-invoicing. But when folks in an organization know they're being monitored, they tend to buy less. And the whole demand management aspect, not just of implementing systems and workflows and approvals for buying and payment, but simply knowing that somebody's being monitored, the demand management or big brother effect can be very large in reducing spend. Spend, buying, and payment visibility here is key. Now, what's important to remember here is that simply having systems just doesn't generate visibility. The whole integration and reporting piece is critical, linking together both procurement and AP aspects here, all the way through to payment. Buyer compliance is another major reason we see as well. We used to hear the term thwarting maverick purchasing as a means for investing in P2P and why companies embarked on these systems initially. It's more than that. There's broader compliance. And there's compliance on the supplier side in terms of volume-based discounts and rebate programs as well. But compliance is definitely a component of the business case. Next slide, please. We see use cases built on reduced headcount. I think organizations trying to build a business case for e-invoicing on headcount alone, it's something which is very easy to do, but I would caution against doing that because you'll be greatly reducing the potential value of the tool if it's just about headcount reduction. There's lots of other use cases to consider here around broader initiatives around avoiding duplicate payments, around some of the other benefits we discussed already, around general supplier compliance as well. Next slide, please. So as you've thought about building the business case, certainly technology must factor into play. And we have a huge issue with kind of singular approaches to defining where vendors are on a 2x2 quadrant or a wave. We think that can create a shortlist, but it's not necessarily the best shortlist for a specific organization. So your own shortlist of providers should be based on your own needs. And in our research, we've kind of defined different categories of companies looking at P2P. There are some organizations who are after what we call compliance now, folks who want compliance yesterday. And typically, SaaS-based solutions with rapid deployment can provide a quick means of getting it. There are those who don't want to get fired for choosing a particular solution, so they want to go with a big name. Nothing wrong with this, but you should be aware of that. If your organization, your IT organization, is more comfortable with big names, you might not even consider smaller players, even if they can provide better technical capability. Renewal price pressure. We've seen this lots of times. We've seen it with Ariba, Oracle, and SAP, and others. That with legacy systems, in many cases, you can throw in a replacement tool set for less than the cost of maintenance. And if you factor in network fees as well, that can factor into decisions to go with one type of provider or another, depending on your own situation. There are those who are heavily down the path of SAP or Oracle or PeopleSoft, but might have some caveats around who to go with. And for those organizations, there are broader network ecosystems which the ERP providers tend to work with. SAP is further along in building network partners than Oracle is and PeopleSoft is in this case. There are those with very specific geographic and industry-specific requirements as well. In this case, on one particular vendor in North America, SideQuest, Science Warehouse in the UK, and others as well in the case of laboratory equipment, clinical research. We've got very specific solutions for that environment on the content management piece. So critical to understand where you are and what you need. Next slide, please. I want to leave you with a number of key recommendations now for broader P2P initiatives. Not going to go through all the bullets here. I want to get to some e-invoicing specific recommendations and to wrap up in a minute. But a few things to harp on here. Critical to consider how one size does not fit all. That's absolutely key as you think about who to go with in terms of solution partners, but also in your deployment approach. You've got to think around broader PDE ecosystems rather than solely systems vendors, right? So think about all these different areas: supplier enablement, the advanced capabilities around certain types of e-invoicing providers, the catalog content management piece, discounting, supply chain finance, all these different areas together. We think it's important to think about covering both PO and non-PO based spend as well in various tools. And don't assume that just because you're slamming in a system for e-procurement that you'll cover all of the requisitioning activity outside of direct spend. It's not the case at all. One thing we've seen here on the services side is organizations who try and kind of cram through an approach around having a PO tied to dollar volume in terms of units. Look out for that as kind of a warning sign the system is being kludged together for certain types of spend it's not ready for. In terms of some e-invoicing specific recommendations, critical to think about furthering the relationship of finance and different elements of finance and procurement together. Critical to think about the technology platform decision outside of labor cost decisions alone. We think technology is a huge enabler here. Going beyond just FTE-based cost reduction in your analysis we think is key. And then thinking about how do you improve data quality at the source and drive to that kind of quintessential nirvana of straight-through processing in as many cases as possible and all that can enable. Next slide, please. So to wrap up a few invoicing recommendations going forward, a few things we think are important as well. Measuring supplier satisfaction and performance before and after a system. If suppliers do not like a process, if they fall out during the onboarding process, you're not going to gain the adoption on the supplier side you need. Also goes for measuring stakeholder satisfaction internally as well. Think about the flexibility you need around matching use cases. Organizations occasionally want to go beyond a three-way match. There are four-way and five-way matching approaches. And think about covering all spend types as well. Critical here to think about how do you cover broader suppliers, all shapes, sizes, and geographies. And last, I want to kind of harp again on tying this notion of supplier management, going back to that slide on the portal initiatives, into programs around P2P focused on the quality of master data, and how do you drive suppliers to self-service around updating their information to make sure it's accurate. AP data ages extremely fast, much faster than you think, and unlike a good Bordeaux, after a couple of years, it's going to be quite off. Next slide, please. So a few predictions looking forward before we wrap up here. We would argue that interoperability and the role of supplier networks is going to increase in the coming years. So think about network approaches for enablement. We think there's going to be a lot of vendor consolidation in the next couple of years. So make sure from a contracting perspective, if you're working with a large vendor in the space who's best of breed or a smaller one, that you're protected in the case of change of control. Discounting and working capital programs, we think in many cases are going to become more dependent on e-invoicing foundations. There are ways around this, by the way. I don't want to get into it in this presentation today. There are ways around e-invoicing if you really want to avoid it to get into discounting and working capital, but we don't recommend it as a general rule. But we do think those programs are going to bulk up in the coming years. We think the U.S. is going to catch up to Europe in terms of adoption. We think business cases and visibility are going to drive that versus new regulations. Though with a new Congress and a new president, there's always been talk of a VAT in the U.S. Who knows if that will ever happen? But even if we don't have regulations tied to e-invoicing, we think the U.S. will catch up. And we think a lot of organizations are going to think about the second half of P2P, the e-invoicing piece, just as much as the first half on the e-procurement side. So 3 final takeaways I want to leave you with. The first is that e-invoicing is an absolutely essential component of the broader P2P equation. Please don't delay investments because of e-procurement selections, upgrades, or decisions. Number 2, consider all the elements of the solution equation based on your needs across AP, procurement, and treasury. Don't optimize for one at the expense of the others. And then understand where your journey should take you tomorrow in the context of where you are today and the steps necessary to get to the ultimate objective. So don't think about, heck, how do we jump to level 3 maturity? Think about, let's get everything right at level 1, at level 2. What's necessary to move forward? Organizational change often happens much slower than technology adoption or working with a BPO in certain cases. So think about that organizational change piece. Next slide, please. I just thought I would insert my contact details here if anybody wants to reach out. Also, a quick plug. I know most folks on this call are probably focused mostly on P2P, but one of our areas of coverage extensively across our sites and our research services are looking at commodity markets for procurement and supply chain organizations. And we have our own event in March covering this topic called Commodity Edge in Chicago, actually, at Chicago O'Hare, looking at commodity price trends and strategies for sourcing and advanced sourcing techniques and commodity management, and specifically procurement organizations in the manufacturing, food, and CPG spaces. So I would encourage you to check that out on our site if you're interested. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Matt.
Thank you very much indeed, Jason, for that fascinating insight. And before we go into questions and answers, obviously feel free to keep submitting your questions while I'm talking. But as I mentioned earlier, Shared Services Link, the research that we did that I mentioned earlier has led us to create an event to address all of these issues that that Jason just went into with your peers. So I'm just going to kind of show you the calendar of what we've got coming with Shared Services Link and how we can actually help you with some of these challenges. So as I mentioned, we've got the annual Procure-to-Pay Leaders Meeting, which takes place May 23rd to 25th over in Chicago. And for those of you based around Europe or can get to Europe, we also have a similar European event in London in June. But as a special present for everyone that's attended the webinar and also for everyone that's downloading this afterwards, we have a special offer for you. For everyone that's attending or downloading this webinar today with Spend Matters, we are offering 2 delegates for the price of 1 for our annual Procure-to-Pay Leaders Meeting. So I think we've already got an early bird discount for that meeting. So please do take advantage of this. And that offer is valid for all of you until the 9th of March. And there's a quote down there at the bottom of your screen. Also, we've got a great webinar series coming up next month in March, one around automated reconciliations. We've got Henry Iams talking later in the month from PayStream Advisors about e-invoicing adoption in 2012. We've got a very interesting topic around social networking for shared services that we're touching on, and also Virgin Atlantic sharing their secrets around their e-invoicing program. So it's time for questions. And Jason, first question we have for you today. Do you often see a relationship between general systems or ERP maturity and P2P maturity?
It's a good one. I think there's some correlation, but you know the R-squared value there is not as great as somewhat might believe. And that's because in lots of cases in recent years it's been possible to circumvent kind of ERP maturity upgrades through using best-of-breed tools within both e-procurement and e-invoicing. But without broader IT integration, it will only get you so far. So we think it's absolutely critical, and oftentimes if you look at more mature organizations, kind of on the Jeffrey Moore scale of IT sophistication, that he would describe them as the innovators and the early adopters. Those organizations on the latest version of ECC, for example, those trying to migrate to ultimately the single instance, if you will, which so few companies achieve, but ultimately would like to if they can. those organizations ultimately, even if they have best-of-breed investments as well in P2P, tend to have the greatest visibility. But again, because of those tools out there from multiple providers, whether they're e-invoicing specific or e-procurement specific, they can get you to a certain point without ERP necessarily being on the latest and greatest.
Okay, thanks, Jason. There's another question here. Where do you recommend getting started? Invoicing automation, procurement, e-invoicing, etc. Where's best to start? What technology or technology area is best for you to start?
I'm a student here as much as anyone. My background before getting into broader P2P was more on the e-procurement side. But one of my mentors in looking at the space is a guy named Pete Pete Laughlin, who runs a fellow blog in the space, Purchase Insight, and he's encouraged me over the years to not poo-poo the basic invoice automation space before getting into the more advanced invoicing use cases. If you're more of a technology geek like I am, you can look at scan capture for example, in the whole OCR space and dismiss it and say, it will never be true E. But there's actually a lot of strong capabilities there. And as you think about moving up the curve, perhaps jumping into a full-blown e-invoicing network enablement approach and trying to get completely rid of paper, and not having any type of scanning capability, it might not make sense to jump that far initially. So in terms of where to get started, I would go back to looking at maturity as a guide to begin with, and thinking about how can you make that change in between levels rather than just shooting for level 3 maturity to start with.
Okay, thanks for that, Jason. Another question around vendor consolidation. Do you expect to see consolidation amongst the invoicing vendors? And if you do, is there any advice or precautions that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, especially in Europe. Probably less so in the U.S. and the rest of the world, just because of the number of providers and the concentration. But we see a battle going on right now between certain providers who are intent on consolidating the smaller marketplace in Europe. It's a larger marketplace, but with many smaller providers in different countries. So with Ariba's recent acquisition, Basware's recent acquisition, with SAP with broad ambitions in this space, we think there's going to be significant consolidation. And protecting yourself, if you work with a smaller supplier, is critical. However, in lots of cases, there's two sides of the coin in working with these network operators and the invoicing providers. There's the supplier engagement, which in many cases a supplier might pay per transaction. There could be a flat rate. They could buy a certain number of transactions. It could be free in the case of folks like Pajero and as well as others. And then there's the buyer side as well. You've got to think about the buyer fees for licensing a system, or the monthly fees for hosting, if there's broader plumbing involved in the e-invoicing, and certainly the P2P side as well. And with that, you've got to think about protections, especially on the buy side, in terms of contracts and change of control. Unfortunately, suppliers do not have very much to go on if their provider is acquired and they've got to start paying new fees as a result of the acquisition. But typically, at least we would hope that any potential acquirer would honor existing agreements to a point. So for example, if you bought a bundle of 1,000 or 10,000 invoices as a supplier or transactions, the acquirer would honor that. But you can't take anything for granted in contracting in general. So protecting yourself, we think, is paramount. We don't see folks going under. We don't think you should be concerned over working with smaller providers in this space. We think even smaller providers on a high growth trajectory with some degree of risk because of venture capital investment or otherwise, even if they run on hard times, are likely to be acquired. So we're not as concerned over a screen going dark as change of control issues. So that's what we'd recommend to focus on.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Just conscious that we are almost hitting the hour mark here. So if you are able to stay for another, say, 10 minutes, we're going to get through quite a few more questions with Jason that have been asked. If not, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and I'm sure we'll see you again very soon. So next question, Jason. You didn't talk too much about the relationship between IT, accounts payable, and procurement. What are the best means of enhancing collaboration between all of those groups?
I mean, there's probably multiple levels and approaches to doing it. In one of our presentations, we talk quite commonly through. We look at kind of the future of procurement and finance together. And one scenario we see is finance increasingly taking over P2P, including e-procurement and including indirect procurement. And whether they take it over from a reporting standpoint and the head of procurement reports into finance, or whether it's more systems driven, is almost irrelevant. But among that scenario, AP and procurement are really forced together under one structure, and we see some real benefits to that actually from a broader standpoint in P2P and systems adoption and compliance in the organization. So that's kind of one extreme. The other extreme, and we see, is procurement standing on its own, finance standing on its own, kind of AP as kind of something sandwiched in the middle, but clearly reporting into finance, treasury off to the side, occasionally issuing requirements around working capital needs, and now payment terms shall be extended to 60 days based on working capital requirements, things of that nature. And that's where AP and procurement really become kind of the ne'er-do-wells of treasury and finance policy. And procurement must apologize to its suppliers for having to change terms. That's kind of the other extreme. We think in lots of cases it's somewhere in the middle, and there are strong use cases for collaborating and working together. But oftentimes, if you can build the business case for both organizations in terms of what's possible, right? What are the outcomes of better visibility into working capital requirements? How can we reduce supply risk, a topic we didn't get into at all today, by having greater visibility into what suppliers are doing? Are they taking discounts or not? Do we see patterns of folks and how they're working with us on the supplier side? How often they're logging into portals? How quickly they're submitting and checking on invoices? These can yield certain insights which we might not otherwise have, which are useful to both organizations.
Okay. A couple of questions actually around e-invoicing adoption, Jason. The first question is, do you see the widespread adoption of e-signature in e-invoicing in the US? And another question related to e-invoicing adoption, is PDF data capture rather than OCR going to see an explosion with a wider adoption of e-invoicing? The first question around e-signatures and the second around PDF data capture explosion.
Yeah, I feel more confident in talking about the second and offering some scenarios than the first. I would say in terms of e-signature adoption, which is kind of a whole subdomain by itself, we've actually looked at it in contract management technology more closely, and we've seen in lots of cases a lot of OEM relationships between EchoSign and DocuSign and others, and we see Adobe making its own purchase in the space as well, trying to link together the PDF side and the signature piece. But in terms of the invoicing, haven't seen as broad-based adoption of digital signing and signatures yet here as we have in some other areas, more on the procurement side, on the contract side, where it's not becoming ubiquitous yet, but it's becoming kind of an embedded option, and lots of companies are springing forward each time. But definitely a space to watch. In terms of the whole PDF piece, and what is a PDF, right? If a supplier outputs an invoice as a PDF from QuickBooks or Great Plains or what have you, or an online accounting package, is that an e-invoice? I think the answer depends on how much information is contained within the PDF and how it's extracted. The concept of scanning a paper invoice and any types of latency that can entail if it's mailed, if it's sent to a center, to be captured, versus if it's machine driven, right? If it's output directly via email, and that metadata, the XML data from the PDF is extracted directly at 100% accuracy rate. That's a different scenario entirely. So I wouldn't poo-poo the concept of a PDF as an electronic invoice if you can get at the metadata. We've seen some pretty slick approaches by Transepta and others in terms of getting at it. We definitely consider it part of the equation.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Another question here. Do you maintain a shortlist of providers companies should consider? So is there a short list of providers that are maintained?
Yeah, and we do look at shortlist, even though we've never gone down the path of creating, a Gartner or Forrester-like quadrant or wave. As we look at shortlists in this area, I would go back to the presentation and some of our research in which we featured in more detail. You can look at shortlists based on where organizations rate and rank themselves. If compliance is a priority today or yesterday, who should you consider? If you're going down the ERP path, but you have concerns, who in the ERP partner ecosystem should you consider along with SAP, Oracle, or PeopleSoft? If you're concerned about pricing, who are vendors to consider? If you're in a certain industry or geography and you've got certain requirements, who is best to consider? So we don't think in terms of one shortlist, and we think in terms of creating a shortlist based on where organizations stack up in terms of their own unique needs and requirements. And when we've done selections in the past for companies, both in e-procurement and e-invoicing on an advisory basis, we quickly like to size up companies based on internal discussions, questions, interviews, and you can often plot them very quickly in a similar way to how they would plot themselves, asking similar questions. And from that, the shortlist emerges.
Okay. There's another question around P2P platforms. How do you see the possibilities of implementing a P2P platform in a country where e-invoicing is not yet legal, or in a country where the percentage of e-invoice is lower than 10%?
I think the question of legality is probably first and foremost what should be considered there. And if you can't go down the path of moving onto a true e-environment, in that case, on the invoicing front, you can still move down the path on the e-procurement side. And there are some kludges on the e-invoicing side around collecting information as well. If paper is still required, you can still get that information in a digital format. And there's a lot of benefits to doing that, even if there still needs to be a paper record. But I wouldn't let those requirements or laws discourage companies from considering both e-procurement and the digitization of printed invoice receipt and related data, even if there needs to be a paper-based trail of it as well. In terms of specific regulatory requirements in certain markets, that's where a larger network provider who's got local agreements with different operators, who's focused on embedding the local laws, and most recently the country with the latest set of requirements, which is proving to be a bit complicated as it gets implemented, is Mexico. It's kind of like choosing an audit firm. You don't want to choose an audit firm for every country you do business in. You kind of want a GC who can walk you through the process and provide a single audit. At least per operating entity. And the same is true in terms of country-specific requirements, even if you end up working with lots of smaller providers. Making sure you're compliant from a tax and regulatory standpoint is key.
Excellent. Thanks, Jason. Well, I think we've run out of time for questions. There's quite a few more questions, actually, that people have asked. So we will follow up with you after the webinar and put you in contact with Jason to help you answer those questions. So once again, thank you very much indeed, Jason, for sharing your insight today. Really fascinating insight into some of the research that you and your team at Spend Matters have been involved in recently. I hope you can join me in Chicago, everyone, this May for what promises to be an incredible 3 days of idea sharing for leaders in the Procure-to-Pay process. So that's all from me. That's all from Jason. Goodbye.